He drove a $70000 SUV through the middle of my hunting path, flattened my turkey decoy like it was roadkill, rolled down his tinted window, and said, "This falls under HOA jurisdiction now." That was the moment I knew I'd either be arrested for assault or creative sabotage. Lucky for both of us, I chose the latter. Now, I've lived on this land longer than my truck has been leaking oil in the driveway, and that's saying something. The trail behind my cabin wasn't a road. It was a personal escape route, a winding dirt path through whispering trees and rust-colored leaves, carved by generations of stubborn men in flannel and flint. Nobody drove it unless they were bleeding, drunk, or part of the family, and usually all three. That path was sacred, and this smug, manicured HOA inspector had decided to defile it with tire treads and hubris. Craig Mutton. His name sounded like a cheap sandwich, and he had the personality of one too, dry, self-important, and full of unseasoned judgment. He wasn't even from here. He bought the corner McMansion 6 months ago, joined the Homeowners Association the next week, and by month 2 was quoting regulations that sounded made up. Clause 14.2b prohibits unstructured flora clustering, and no domestic fowl may appear unaccompanied in a lawn-facing direction. The first time I met Craig, he was measuring the angle of my birdbath with a laser level. The second time, he slapped a $150 fine on my door because my split-rail fence posed an optical hazard to passing joggers. But the third time? That was the SUV incident, and something deep in my spleen snapped. He had been poking around the property line under the guise of easement reassessment. He wore a bright yellow HOA vest, likely self-issued, and a Bluetooth headset he never used except to shout things like "copy that," initiating perimeter sweep into dead air. That morning, while I was dressing a deer and sipping coffee laced with something stronger, I heard the unmistakable crunch of tires over brittle autumn leaves. Then came the clattering of my broken decoy. Then Craig's smug face appearing from the window, like the moon of smugness rising over a dark forest. "This is unauthorized terrain," he declared. "We'll likely need to pave this. It's a potential utility corridor." I stood there, bloodied hands from field dressing, holding a skinned buck's leg like a bat, and said, "You pave it, I'll plant daisies in your radiator." He laughed, not because it was funny, but because he thought I was bluffing. He backed out slowly, kicking up a rooster tail of leaves and mud, and I stood there boiling. That night I skipped dinner, poured a third bourbon, and started welding. The spike trap took me 3 hours. It wasn't meant to kill. This wasn't a medieval movie. It was meant to teach a lesson. I used rusted nails, rebar, and an old rake welded to a saw blade. The whole thing looked like a porcupine on meth. I buried it just beneath the trail's topsoil, camouflaged under leaves, angled precisely for a tire-width strike zone. Legal gray area? Sure. Morally satisfying? Deeply. The next morning, I made coffee and sat on the porch like it was Christmas. The air was crisp. Birds chirped. Squirrels did squirrel things. I waited. Around 9:43 a.m., I heard the rumble. That overpowered, overwaxed monstrosity of a vehicle roared down the gravel road like it was starring in a car commercial. He even had the audacity to play opera music, loud enough to startle the deer population into another zip code. I took another sip of my coffee. It was showtime. He turned onto the trail again. My trail. My home's artery to peace. And then it happened. An eruption of air like a cartoon balloon meeting a nail. His SUV jerked, wobbled, and listed hard to the left. Another hiss. Another pop. 4 for 4. The beast was crippled. I heard the brakes squeal and the door swing open. From a safe distance, hidden behind my garden gnome, I watched Craig kneel beside the tires like a man grieving a fallen comrade. His mouth formed a perfect O of shock, disbelief, and faint betrayal. Then he looked around. He must have realized in that moment he'd been hunted. He stood up slowly, adjusted his HOA vest like it was armor, and pulled out his phone, probably calling the sheriff or a towing company, maybe a therapist. I didn't care. I turned, walked back into my cabin, and let the screen door creak dramatically behind me. By afternoon, the neighborhood buzzed. Someone said there were wild porcupines on the loose. Another rumor said Craig had tried to drive through a swamp. I said nothing, except to one neighbor, Donnie, the ex-Marine who once launched a potato cannon at a drone for flying over his lawn. I caught him grinning at the busted SUV and nodding slightly. He didn't say anything, just handed me a six-pack of beer like it was a medal. Of course, Craig couldn't let it go. That night, I found a printed notice duct taped to my mailbox. Potential security breach reported in the vicinity. Surveillance forthcoming. HOA recommends all residents cooperate with inspections. It was underlined. Twice. This was war now. Not just me against Craig. Me against bureaucracy in cargo shorts. But I was ready. I had ammo. Not the gun kind, though I wasn't short on that either, but something stronger. I had patience, land, a whole pile of rusted junk, and a memory sharp enough to catalog every petty violation Craig had committed. The HOA didn't know it yet, but they'd poked a bear. A bear who liked welding at midnight and had an NSA-trained neighbor named Mrs. Dalrymple who once cracked a Cold War code using a crossword puzzle. But that's a story for later. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The trail was quiet again. Order, in its most chaotic form, had been restored. For now. By the next morning, Craig's shredded SUV had been towed out like the carcass of a fallen beast, leaving only the gouged earth and the faint smell of scorched rubber. But even as the scent of victory lingered in the air, I knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done. The kind of man who irons his socks and labels his pantry jars doesn't just let something like this slide. Craig Mutton was the type to retaliate, not retreat. And sure enough, he came back with a clipboard and a vengeance. At first, it was subtle. A few extra patrols passed my house during his morning inspections, which was just him in his oversized golf cart pretending to be Homeland Security. Then came the neighborhood emails, cryptic little notes with vague warnings like unauthorized terrain alterations pose safety risks to the community, or unpermitted landscaping may lead to escalation. I could practically hear him whispering those sentences to himself while sipping lukewarm chamomile. But then, things got real. I noticed a camera nailed to a pine tree across the road, pointed directly at my cabin. Not wildlife camo either. This one had a blinking red light and a small, plastic property monitored sign zip-tied to the trunk like a badge. It was so obviously his handiwork it might as well have come with a monogrammed HOA tag and a court summons. I stood in front of it for 10 seconds and flipped it off, then waved like I was on a game show. 2 hours later, there was another email about disturbing gestures. So I decided to respond the only way a rational adult man in his 50s would. I built a scarecrow the size of a moose, wearing my old army jacket and holding a full-length mirror. Every time the sun came up, that mirror shot a blinding glare straight into Craig's camera lens, like a laser beam from heaven. It was art. And it worked. 3 days later, the camera vanished, and Craig retaliated by filing a formal complaint that my mailbox was too rural in aesthetic. It became a game of chicken. Only neither of us was driving a car. We were hurling insults through legal loopholes and passive-aggressive home improvements. My lawn decorations grew increasingly abstract. He sent citations so fast the printer ink hadn't dried. I installed a hammock made of deer antlers. He banned outdoor seating that wasn't neutrally colored. I painted the hammock bright orange. We were locked in a battle of wills, and the neighborhood was starting to notice. Most of the neighbors just watched from behind their curtains, hoping the fire wouldn't spread. But a few picked sides. Donnie, the ex-Marine, stood with me, obviously. So did Tony and Marla from 3 doors down. Young couple, big fans of beer and backyard freedom. Meanwhile, the HOA loyalists, led by a woman named Trisha, who wore yoga pants like a uniform and whose dog had a wardrobe, started a group chat called Operation Order. Their mission? Keep the neighborhood classy, even if it meant surveilling each other like Cold War spies. I should have expected Craig to escalate. But what I didn't expect was the night I found the generator. It was late, well past midnight, and I was hiking the back edge of the property where the tree line gets thick, and the only light comes from the moon and your own paranoia. I had trail cams back there, real ones, for game tracking, not surveillance. But one had gone offline, and I didn't like that. So I went to check. That's when I saw the faint blue flicker through the trees. Not firelight, not flashlights. Electricity. Humming, pulsing, out of place. I followed it until I found something I never expected. A shack. Not mine. Not anyone's I knew. Slapped together with plywood, propped on cinder blocks, humming with power from a gas generator parked behind it. Inside, I could see wires, blinking consoles, and what looked like some kind of satellite equipment. The kicker? Parked right beside it, half hidden under camo tarp, was Craig's spare SUV. I froze. This wasn't about trails anymore. Craig was running something. I didn't know what it was, but it smelled illegal. At the very least, unethical. At the very worst, something that could end with federal agents zip-lining out of helicopters. I needed help. Not from the cops. They'd just get confused and probably cite me for trespassing. I needed someone smarter, sharper, and more paranoid than I was. So I called Mrs. Dalrymple. Most folks in the neighborhood thought she was just a sweet, cardigan-wearing widow who grew hydrangeas and baked muffins. What they didn't know was that she'd worked in counterintelligence for 29 years. I knew because she once corrected a History Channel documentary mid-sentence while holding a martini. She had the reflexes of a jungle cat and a Rolodex of old contacts that would make the CIA nervous. When I told her about the shack, she didn't blink, just poured 2 cups of tea and said, "About time someone noticed." Turns out, she'd been keeping an eye on Craig too, ever since he tried to fine her for having non-native flora in her rose garden. She'd already intercepted 2 of his HOA emails using a spoofed router and discovered he was rerouting his internet traffic through a VPN linked to some offshore server. Whatever Craig was up to, it wasn't just about grass height and mailbox paint. He had a side hustle, possibly involving illegal communications hardware. We came up with a plan. She would set up a remote listening device. I would retrieve more footage of the shack, being careful not to trigger the motion alarms. We coordinated our efforts using walkie-talkies from her attic, speaking in code like a pair of Cold War renegades. It was absurd. It was glorious. And it was about to get very real. Craig, oblivious to the fact that he was being hunted now, continued his little crusade. More citations. More threats. He even tried to push a vote to have my property reclassified as transitional land, whatever that meant. But while he was busy measuring my lawn, we were closing in. I knew it would all come to a head soon, and I knew something big had to give. But in that moment, as Mrs. Dalrymple showed me how to reroute his Wi-Fi camera feeds into a local drive, I felt it. That electric buzz you get when you're finally one step ahead of someone who's been making your life miserable. Craig had started a war over a dirt trail, but now the trail was leading straight to his secrets. The night before it all came crashing down, I stood on my porch, staring at the stars, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug, and thinking how things had gotten this far. What started as one man driving an overpriced SUV through my hunting path had spiraled into a full-blown neighborhood Cold War, complete with surveillance drones, spike traps, sabotage, and a makeshift spy operation led by a retired NSA agent. And yet, somehow, it still felt like I was on the right side of history. Craig had gone too far, not just with me, but with the whole community. He'd built a little kingdom of fear, hidden behind bylaws and fine print. But his crown was about to melt. Mrs. Dalrymple had been working behind the scenes like some sort of cardigan-clad war general. She'd intercepted Craig's communications and compiled enough digital breadcrumbs to put together a damning little dossier, the kind that would make any federal investigator perk up like a hound catching a fresh scent. I handled the boots-on-the-ground work. I'd mapped out the shack, documented the generator setup, photographed the signal booster equipment, and even followed Craig to a nearby truck stop where he met with a man in a rental van and exchanged a lock case. It was all there, plain as day. Whatever Craig was transmitting, it wasn't HOA business. The plan was simple in theory and absolutely ridiculous in execution. We'd hijack the upcoming HOA meeting, Craig had scheduled it to vote on a new amendment, giving himself full oversight of all land-adjacent natural routes, meaning my trail would officially fall under his jurisdiction. It was a power grab disguised as a formality, and he'd stacked the board with his loyalists to push it through. But we had something better than votes. We had the truth, and we had a projector. That morning, I borrowed Donnie's trailer and hauled a portable generator, a projection screen, and a carefully hidden flash drive into the community center. Mrs. Dalrymple arrived 15 minutes later with her laptop and a batch of lemon bars, because nothing says, "I'm about to ruin your life," like fresh baked goods. The room filled quickly. Craig stood at the front, clipboard in hand, smug as ever, ready to pass his little dictatorship amendment without a whisper of resistance. I waited until he started reading the motion. Then I stepped forward, tipped my hat, and said, "Before we vote on anything, I think the community should see what Craig's been doing in his spare time." He blinked. "This is a private meeting." Mrs. Dalrymple plugged in the laptop. The projector whirred to life. And then came the first photo. Craig's secret shack, fully lit. Then the equipment. Then the footage of him exchanging the case at the truck stop. Then a satellite map tracing the signal route bouncing from his booster to a flagged offshore node. The room was dead silent, except for the hum of the projector and the faint noise of someone dropping their plastic cup of lemonade. Craig's face went pale. His hands trembled just enough for his clipboard to slide out of his grip and land flat on the tile. He stammered something about misinterpretation, technical experiments, and not-for-profit hobbyist infrastructure. But no one was listening anymore. The illusion had shattered. Tricia, the yoga pants general, stood up and asked, "Craig, are you running a pirate communications network from a shack in the woods?" He didn't answer. He just started walking toward the door. He never made it, because outside, parked at an angle so aggressive it looked like a scene from a cop show, was a black SUV with government plates. Donnie had made a few calls. Not to the local sheriff. To a friend in a 3-letter agency who owed him a favor from their time overseas. 2 suited agents stepped out, flashed badges, and said one beautiful sentence. "Craig Mutton, we need to speak with you about unauthorized signal distribution and failure to report income from unlicensed tech exports." The room exploded. Some people cheered. Tricia fainted. Tony filmed the whole thing for his Instagram page. As Craig was escorted out, he looked back at me with pure hatred, but also something else. Something like respect? No, that couldn't be right. It didn't matter. He was gone. The HOA board was dissolved that week. Every citation Craig ever issued was voided. The shack was dismantled and hauled off by men in hazmat suits. His McMansion went up for sale, and the listing carefully avoided any mention of unique signal enhancements. I was asked to join the interim committee, but politely declined. I said I'd rather spend my time reinforcing my hammock and drinking beer with Donnie. The new HOA, led by a few reasonable folks who just wanted potholes filled and garbage picked up on time, passed a new set of rules. Rule 1. No unauthorized surveillance. Rule 2. No HOA vehicles on private land. Rule 3. The hunting trail was now officially registered as a historic rural pathway, protected from development, landscaping, and all HOA interference. I laminated that clause and hung it in my bathroom. And as for Mrs. Dalrymple, well, she's become something of a legend. Some say she's working on a memoir. Others think she's been reactivated by an unnamed agency. I just know she visits every Sunday for coffee, and we play a few rounds of cards while watching squirrels raid Craig's abandoned bird feeder. The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. People relaxed. Flags flew at weird angles again. Lawns grew a little wilder. And I went back to walking that trail every morning with my thermos and my thoughts uninterrupted. One afternoon, I spotted a deer standing exactly where Craig's SUV had once broken down. It looked at me, nodded, and vanished into the trees. Or maybe that was the bourbon talking. The only trace left of Craig was a book he self-published a month later. It was titled, "I Tried to Make Things Better, The HOA Years." It had a cover photo of him holding a clipboard like a sword. I bought 10 copies, mailed one to each board member, and used the rest for kindling during our community bonfire. In the end, I didn't win because I was smarter or richer. I won because I was patient, determined, and just crazy enough to turn a war over a dirt path into a neighborhood reckoning. You can't regulate grit. You can't find someone into silence when they've got an old welder, a squirrel army, and a neighbor with Cold War clearance. The HOA may have had bylaws, but I had the land. And the land, in the end, always wins.